And it's really my pleasure today. I'm really just here to introduce my friend Joe Witt, who's an associate professor in UT's Department of Religious Studies, which is one of the departments that we support. His research, teaching, and public engagement center on religious studies and analysis of community encounters with environmental issues, such as resource extraction, pollution, climate change, and food security. His first major project investigated the multiple ways that religious worldviews shaped attitudes toward mountaintop removal mining in Appalachia, the coal mining industry, of course, and conversely, how debates about mountaintop removal also shaped new religious responses. Fascinating work. The major findings from this work were published in his first book, the title of which is Religion and Resistance in Appalachia, Faith and Fight Against Mountaintop Removal Coal Mining. From 2011 to 2022, Professor Witt served as an assistant and later associate professor of religion at Mississippi State University. There, he engaged with another long-term research project focused on the efforts of Vietnamese American fishermen and their families on the Gulf Coast to respond to challenges such as Hurricane Katrina, the BP oil spill, and ongoing threats of biodiversity loss and sea level rise. Influenced by his experiences in Appalachia, Witt also helped to develop new approaches to place-based and community-engaged teaching in Mississippi, examining the connections between racial inequalities, agricultural history, and food security. Professor Witt continues this research program at the University of Tennessee, which we're really happy about, focusing on local examples of environmental justice, injustice, and resilience, while developing engaged pedagogies to help facilitate long-lasting connections between students and community stakeholders in East Tennessee. Additionally, he serves as associate editor of the Journal of Environmental Studies and Sciences. So it's a real pleasure. I can't wait to hear what you have to say, Joe. Thank you so much for doing this. Welcome.
Great. Well, thanks, everybody. Thank you, Alyssa, and thank you, Amy. I'll go ahead and share my screen here. Yeah, thank you all for having me, for inviting me to talk to you all. And like Amy already pointed out, this is my first year here at the University of Tennessee. So I'm still meeting people. I'm really grateful to be invited here, but I'm really interested in learning more about all the folks who are with us here today, and hopefully I'll give you something interesting to think about, a little bit more about what I'm up to. So I think maybe to one degree, when you hear this phrase, religions and the environment, my specific subfield is in religion and the environment. And to one degree, that might sound something like an oxymoron, right? The connections between religions and nature. Oftentimes, in the West, we conceive of religion as about the supernatural, not the natural. What does it have to do with the environment? Or if we're talking about environmental issues, then we're talking about science and policy, right? Not religion. We need to keep religion out of it. Is sometimes an attitude we have about this. But if we start thinking a little bit more deeply about just, what is religion really as kind of a human phenomena, we start to find that maybe the connections aren't too surprising. So I have here, if you can see, this is a very famous quote from Gus Speth, co-founder of the NRDC. And he said this at a conference. It's kind of been thought to be apocryphal, but he did say this at a conference, which is why it's kind of hard to track down. But ultimately, right here, you see him making this point that as a lawyer himself, as a policymaker, he thought that the biggest issues that they were facing were these, technical issues, that you need more science and more policy to deal with them. But as he says here, what he discovers is that really it's more of an ethical or even a spiritual, he says, change that's needed. So he's pointing here to this kind of tension between not just what do we need to do or what do we do, what causes our problems, what do we need to do for our solutions, but why should we do it? That type of, deeper ethical question. So if we start thinking about religion as dealing with these, ethical systems, obviously religion is not the only thing that deals with ethical systems or moral systems. Well, then the connection between these two perhaps becomes a little bit more clear. I thought, given the One Health initiative, I thought I'd also just point this one out, talking more about the connections of health specifically. But obviously, our good friend Wendell Berry makes this point in his essay, Health is Membership. That actually the root word for health is related to whole, as in complete, and also holy. So just in the etymology of the word itself, you find these types of connections. And if anything, it's only relatively recently in human history that we've disconnected these issues. And so for him, for Barry, of course, he sees community as being the way of restoring these types of ethical commitments, and then also developing the types of practices that we might need to lead to sustainable futures, to better health results, or whatever goals we might be hoping to achieve. So just that as a way, as a bit of a primer, to way of how we can think about religion, more complexly as a facet of the human experience, to see how more complexly it integrates into even issues of science and policy and the environment. So with the time today, and actually, thankfully, Amy already kind of introduced some of these projects. What I thought I'd do is just talk really quickly about what it looks like to study the environment from a religious studies perspective. Perhaps a little bit basic for some folks, but I just wanted to kind of give a bit of a sense of the diversity of the different ways to go about this. But then also talk a little bit more detail about some major projects that I've been involved with, and give you a sense of how I integrate these religious studies methods into my own work. But then I also want to leave with some further resources for you all. I think that engaging religion theory, religious communities in, a scientific, technical, health issues is definitely an important way of giving a more, complete account of what's going on and how to deal with it. And so I hope, all the people in attendance today can maybe find something here relevant for their own work. So first off, academic study of religion and nature, just really quickly, religious studies, or the study of religion, is pretty much as old as religion itself, but traditionally we kind of break this up in the academic study into a couple different departments. So the first, which maybe is what a lot of people initially think of when you think of the study of religion, is what we can call theology. Now, of course, not all religious or scholars who work within religious traditions call their work theology. But nonetheless, kind of as a shorthand term. And this is just, work within a specific religious tradition. So assuming the faith statements, assuming the creeds, the ethical systems are true, what then environment, what then health, right? Following from within that framework. And so this is a field that has been deeply engaged with environmental issues for a relatively long time. John Cobb, this Is It Too Late? A Theology of Ecology. It was 1971 when he wrote that. John Cobb he's still alive. He's a process theologian at Claremont. But then also, many of you might be familiar with Pope Francis's 2015 Laudato Si. Francis takes his papal name after Saint Francis, of course, the patron saint of ecology. And so with that environmental message from within, his specific Catholic perspective, but also speaking out about environmental issues to the rest of the world. So theology, that's one constructive area where environmental thought is being done within the study of religion. But then there's also what we can call religious studies, which is more representative of what I do. So taking our steps out, or stepping out of a specific religious tradition and trying to study them a little bit more objectively, quote unquote. So Max Mueller called this the science of religion, which is not really a way we describe it. But instead of working within a tradition, how do we compare or look at different religious traditions to understand something a little bit more fundamental about the human experience? So this manifests in a couple of different approaches. I think many people tend to be familiar with comparative religious studies. If you took a comparative religion class in college, Houston Smith, or people like that, Hero with a Thousand Faces, are famous examples of that type of approach. So how can we find commonalities between these different theological systems, and then what do we learn about the human experience by comparing and contrasting these things? A great example of this with regard to the environmental issue is the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology, which starts in the 1980s, but persists today. It starts at Harvard, then it moves over to Yale. But basically, they're interested. They sponsor a 10-volume book series, and trying to identify what are the environmental dimensions of different religious traditions, trying to find some sort of common ground between them, just kind of elevating them up for the use of different communities. But then also with the hope that if we can find what is eco-groovy about these different religions, maybe that can motivate people to adopt those ethics, adopt those values, and then therefore impact their changes. And so the Forum on Religion and Ecology 4 has been very influential for a lot of NGOs, a lot of international policy work. The World Wildlife Fund has an outreach, a faith outreach office now. UN Environment Program has its own kind of connection to religious communities. So this has been another effort that's really had a lot of influence on NGOs and policy work. And then finally, maybe a third perspective tied to religious studies would be what I can call critical religious studies, which rather than assuming we've got these things that are called religions that are out there somewhere that exist, you know, the phrase they often use is sui generis, kind of their own, in their own unique style. Instead, maybe what's more interesting is seeing how religion itself is a type of discourse, a type of way that human societies organize themselves, make meaning, and understand, you know, their own experiences. So simply labeling this kind of critical religious studies is a way of kind of moving beyond these things that we might call world religions and seeing, you know, how religion theory helps to explain, you know, deeper facets of the human experience. So ultimately, all three of these different perspectives, you know, can work together. They're not mutually exclusive. But for me, I tend to kind of land in the religious studies field, and I tend to combine both the comparative and what I'm calling the critical views here. So with that as a bit of an introduction, I thought I'd really quickly talk about some of the projects that I've, you know, involved myself in to try to give you a little bit more specific sense of what this particular kind of work can look like. So as Amy already pointed out, my first major study was on mountaintop removal coal mining. And again, I'm sure many people are probably familiar with what that is. The mountaintop removal, here's a scene from Larry Gibson's Cayford Mountain in West Virginia. You know, obviously a very intensive form of surface coal mining. The initial environmental impact statement was done way back in 2005. Found things like 7% of, you know, forest had been taken away, 1,200 miles of streams had been, you know, covered by valley fills and things like that. There are also human impacts, health impacts. And there's a study that was commissioned in 2016, but that was then canceled, a federal study that hasn't been, you know, reinstigated about, you know, kind of a federal investigation of the broader health impacts. But in coalfield communities, you have something like 30% greater rates of cancer, 42% greater rates of birth defects, 4-year shorter life expectancy. So ecological and health impacts, you know, associated with this particular, you know, practice. And of course, this is a complex issue, deals with a lot of, you know, political, economic dimensions as well. Obviously, you know, very controversial in a number of ways too. But specifically in my work, I was interested in situating this emergent activism about mountaintop removal within broader histories of environmental activism, but then also coalfield activism in Appalachia a little bit more generally. And so the project, as you know, Amy already mentioned, you know, was published ultimately in this book in 2016 at the University of Kentucky Press, where I did basically field-based methods with participant observation with different environmental organizations, some like United Mountain Defense, which was based here in Knoxville, also others more faith-based, so Christians for the Mountains, also Lindquist Environmental Appalachian Fellowship, which was also here in Knoxville. So all these different types of activist organizations, and then kind of long-form interviews to try and discern the ways that different religious traditions were influencing the ethical motivations that were driving people's work. So again, to kind of go back to Gus Speth's quote, you know, not just the technical issues of mountaintop removal, but why did they care? What were the ethics motivating their work? And a sociologist of religion named Laurel Kearns was really influential for me in kind of laying out these different perspectives. So then what were they? What were the different ethical views? Well, I just kind of identified three kind of major trajectories, again, not mutually exclusive. But at first, you know, why, according to these activists, was mountaintop removal a problem? Well, anthropocentric reasons. So human-centered ethics. These tended to focus on issues of justice. So here we have This Land Is Home to Me, which was commissioned by the Appalachian bishops in 1975. And you see maybe a reference to John Gaventa's work there with powerlessness. But again, tying to this longer Catholic tradition of the preferential option for the poor, that mountaintop removal is particularly impacting, you know, some of the nation's poorest communities, dealing with the vulnerable children, groups like that. So the idea that, you know, this is an issue that needs to be addressed because the greatest harm is being done to the most vulnerable communities. So again, that kind of ethical motivation focused on the needs of the poor, which for many individuals was drawn specifically out of this longer Catholic tradition of, you know, Catholic social work. A second option, however, might be what we call theocentric ethics. And so this was guided or influenced by what was later called creation care ethics. The idea that, you know, in a reading of the Bible, obviously in Genesis 1, you have, to have dominion and subdue the natural world. But in Genesis 2, there's to till and keep the natural world. And so for a lot of people, they interpret this as not a mandate to have dominion over, but to be good stewards of, and not because, we need to, worship the natural world itself, but because it's a command, it's a way of honoring one's commitment to the divine. So theocentric kind of stewardship ethics, this was also, evident within many of the interviews that I had with activists. A third form we can call biocentric ethics, or the idea that nature itself is worthy of moral consideration. So not just the people, not just any sort of commitment that we have to the divine, but also the environment itself. And this was manifest in what Braun Taylor has called dark green religion, different type of spiritual connections to the natural world itself. That you can find this within Christian communities. People like Teilhard de Chardin and Thomas Berry have this kind of vision of creation spirituality, but it also moves outside of Christian communities. Here I have, if people have probably seen this, the agony of Gaia, the idea that the earth itself is wounded, is weeping for the treatment, and the earth itself is worthy of this type of moral consideration. So in the work, these are 3 of the main kind of ethical trajectories informed by different religious traditions that I found people applying to their interpretations of this particular issue. But going back to that issue of critical religious studies, sometimes it's not just about how are people applying their ethical systems to understand an issue, but also, conversely, how are they developing their religious responses out of their different experiences. And so this is where I was really interested in the work of Anna Singh and her concept of friction, the idea that we have these productive disagreements with different diverse stakeholders. And so beyond just religious ethics, I was interested in these types of conversations that people were having that were also shaping their views of the practice. And so some of the debates, some of the issues that came up that weren't particularly religious, that we call them, but debates over the efficacy of direct action. Should people be doing, locking themselves to bulldozers, or should this be, fully political, stay within the appropriate political channels? That was a big debate. Who has a say in this issue? Is it just, coal-filled communities? Is this something that the world needs to have a say in? So, all sorts of debates like that. But another big issue that I seemed to see coming up quite a lot was this connection to the place. This, why are you doing this? And so you have stewardship, you have justice ethics, but you also just have people who say, well, because I care about this place. This place made me who I am. And these aren't necessarily what we call religious arguments, but they're definitely motivational in the ethics around people. So Larry Gibson, we saw a picture from his land there. Right here you see kind of a great, typical quote of him talking about the transformative power of his connection to the land. His experiences on Kafir Mountain are part of why he cares so much about that particular issue. It's not just that he cares about nature in general, it's his experiences in that particular place that shaped him. Also, and I hope many of you knew her, Carol Judy. She worked up at the Clear Fork Community Institute up in Egan. But here you have another kind of great quote where she's talking about there's a spirit to place. And Carol was a traditional root digger. And so she had a really, vast knowledge of kind of environmental connections here in Southern Appalachia. But again, that connection to place was really key to, what she was doing. And so this kind of got me thinking beyond just how are Catholics, evangelicals, applying their ethics. Instead, how are these views being shaped in the context of experience and place? Fortunately, we have theory from religious studies to kind of help out with this, the theoretical work of this. Again, some long quotes, but just to kind of point out that if we think of religion as an activity that makes meaning, then that meaning can also be just what nature is, what value it has, what the place even means. But then at the same time, if religion is also about lived experiences, if religion is shaped out of our experiences in the natural world, or at least our individual responses are, then we can see how those experiences, as Adrian Novakov says here at the end, how those experiences themselves help to shape then religious responses. So you get kind of a back and forth here, that religions can be seen as these things that shape how we view nature in the first place, but then our experiences in nature, or in this case of Appalachia, our experiences in place, then therefore also shape our religious responses to it. So that's ultimately where I wound up in that particular book project. Obviously, some caveats to this is that the anti-strip mining people were not the only people with a deep connection to place. That the anti-strip mining people were not the only people who had religious arguments for doing what they were doing. So I kind of wanted to push back against the whole kind of greening of religion idea that we've got religion to the rescue here, because it doesn't seem like that's what's going to happen. However, if we are trying to, illuminate some of the deeper motivations for beyond just the technical arguments, the economic arguments about mountaintop removal, but what are the deeper motivations? Why do people care so deeply on all sides of this issue? Then I think we need to, illuminate more of those types of ethical and even religious dimensions to it. So that's where I wound up with that project. And again, hopefully makes things a little bit more specific about how religious studies, religions and the environment, that type of work can unfold. Really quickly, I want to kind of highlight again some other findings, some related findings from a very different region, but a very similar project, which has to do with resilience on the Gulf Coast. So as Amy pointed out, starting in 2011, I was faculty at Mississippi State University. And 2011, of course, is right after the BP oil spill in 2010, which itself was only 5 years after Hurricane Katrina. And so at the time, there were still people responding, even 6 years later, still responding to Katrina on the coast. Then the BP oil spill happens. So there's all sorts of challenges happening down on the coast that people are dealing with. But another thing that both state and federal resource agencies began noticing is that increasingly Vietnamese American shrimpers had become a more significant group within the broader shrimping industry. So in Louisiana, by the time of 2011, Vietnamese Americans had made up about 30% of the shrimping industry. And in Mississippi and Alabama, it was up to 50%, despite only being less than 1% of each state's population. So what was going on there? Groups like NOAA, groups like Mississippi and Alabama resource management agencies kind of realized that they didn't have a lot of demographic information about this specific community that was increasingly becoming influential within the shrimping industry. So our project was, a broad collaborative project. It was funded by NOAA and Mississippi Alabama Sea Grant. And here you see some of the specific research that we did. The project itself was basically aimed at understanding a little bit more about Vietnamese American fisheries workers, who they are, what their needs were, how these agencies can, better address their needs, and then also understanding, how this group was becoming so influential within the shrimping industry. For my job in particular was to try and unlock or discover how religious institutions were playing into this the shaping of this community. So we did our kind of dockside interviews, we did our participant observations, but again, one thing that I began noticing, what our research team began noticing, is that you seem to have this real kind of strong connection to place. Why did people come back after Katrina when you didn't have to come back to the coast necessarily, could have gone other places? Here you have this picture of the house. This was one of our focus groups. What you can't see here is that this person was basically an island in Plaquemines Parish of destroyed houses that were still destroyed after Katrina. This guy was thriving. He had a thriving garden. He had, he was hosting all sorts of people at his house, and he was doing great. And so it really kind of speaks to what was going on with this community, that after things like Katrina and the oil spill, they were becoming even more significant in the shrimping industry, as opposed to falling behind in that way. Well, it turns out that other people were asking these questions too, specifically Martin Van Landingham, who's a social scientist at Tulane, who had worked a lot specifically with the Versailles community in New Orleans, which is a Vietnamese American ethnic enclave there, and specifically dealing with Katrina. Why was it that seemingly, the Vietnamese American community responded so quickly? Within 2 years of Katrina, 90% of this community had returned, whereas other communities in New Orleans never came back. Within just a few months after Katrina, 75% of these houses had restored power. So what's going on there? Well, Van Landingham and others highlight what they see as these kind of narratives of progress and survival as having been instrumental for why this community in particular seemed to exhibit certain resilience against Katrina and the oil spill in ways that other communities might not have. So looking at the context, for a lot of these Vietnamese American shrimpers, Katrina was basically not the first rodeo. That why was this community present on the coast in the first place? Well, it has to do with over a century of disruption of of exile, of being refugees. And so Katrina was seen for some within this community as just another example of this ongoing disruption, something we've been through before. So just kind of a quick summary of some of the major historical events, going all the way back to the 1880s with French colonization of what they called Indochina at the time. 1954, this was a major event. Roughly 900,000 predominantly Catholic communities, predominantly shrimping communities or fishing communities in the north of Vietnam were pretty much forced to flee to the south in 1954. And these 900,000 people ultimately become some of the major groups of people who in the 1970s and 80s make their way to the United States through this long period of exile, the first wave, but then also the boat people exiles in the 1980s. Then the fishing industry on the Gulf Coast itself specifically begins to reach out to a lot of these refugee communities who are in places like California or Arkansas, ultimately where they're resettled here in the United States. And then Associate Catholic Charities itself buys up the Versailles community in order to help resettle these predominantly Catholic individuals into this community. So here we have from Oral Histories, Joe Wynn, he's basically saying this, that from their perspective, how do you respond so quickly, seemingly respond so well to something like Katrina? And he's basically saying here, well, we've been through this before. This is nothing compared to surviving for several months on a boat in the Pacific Ocean, right? We've done this before, we can do it again. So this sense of, this narrative of survival having been fundamental to people understanding their experiences. But there's still some questions that we can ask about what's going on here, about this, narratives of survival. So specifically, how do you get from narratives to behaviors? We've got stories of survival, but how does that actually motivate people to come back and rebuild so quickly? Why return to the coast when, again, people could be, especially after Katrina, people could be resettled elsewhere? What is the connection specifically to the coast there? And also, when exactly did these narratives of survival, to see, to at least hear some accounts of it, it sounds like this was an attitude that people already had, that we've been through these experiences, and so therefore we can apply this attitude to the experience of Katrina. However, again, if you look at the oral histories, if you find early generations of exiles and refugees, that type of confidence that Joe Wynn expressed is really not present. You have doubt, you have confusion, you have fear, loneliness was oftentimes expressed back then. So we can ask this question of just when exactly did these narratives emerge? So this became another big dimension of this research project. Again, looking at religion as an institution, our survey found that the majority of our respondents were Catholic, which in the modern day nation of Vietnam is roughly 7% Catholic. In the United States in general, it's roughly 30% Vietnamese Americans Catholic. So obviously an overwhelming influence of the Catholic Church. And we see that just with Catholic Charities helping to resettle communities, but then also the Mary Queen of Vietnam Church in Versailles was actually pretty instrumental in helping that community in particular respond and after Katrina and events. So religion as an institution obviously has a great social role to play to help these communities come back and facilitate resilience and restoration. But to go back to again the kind of more critical religious studies view, how then also can we look at the actual experiences that people are undergoing rather than just religious institutions helping facilitate rebuilding? How about the experiences of exile? How about the experiences in place themselves as helping to shape responses to Katrina and the oil spill? Well, the problem with this, and I know I'll move really quickly, is that a lot of earlier theory of place had to do with this idea of places, that which is permanent, right? Places where you live, places where you stay. If we think even of Mircea Eliade, the religious studies theorist, sacred place is that which is permanent. It's the axis mundi. It's that which you build your community around. And yet here we have a refugee community, which would seem to defy a lot of these older views of place. The disconnection with place from traditional places would seem to be, part of the disruption that the whole community was undergoing. Well, once again, religious studies theory and more contemporary theories of place help us to kind of see past those perhaps more essentialized views of place and religion, and ultimately see how religion emerges out of these types of processes. So lived religion is a great example of a type of approach that, as Bob Orsi here says, sees religion as not something that we apply to our lives, but that emerges out of our lived experiences. That's both stability and then also disruption, where religion emerges. Thomas Tweed's definition of religion here too, as both crossing and dwelling. Religion isn't about just building homes, it's also about how we negotiate the many crossings that we undergo in life, the temporal crossings, but then also, in the case of Vietnamese refugees, physical crossings across the Pacific Ocean. Religion kind of negotiates both of those practices. Also, the geographer Tim Creswell, critical of those older views of Yi Fu Tuan and Relf, people like that, instead of an essentialized view of place, looking at place as practice, much as looking at religion as practice or religion as lived, ultimately then kind of shows how people shape visions of place, that place isn't something that they just respond to, it's also something that they shape in process. So specifically, what were people doing? Well, you have here this example of a protest in Versailles, pretty much immediately after Katrina. The community is able to come back together, thanks in large part, and here you see the Catholic community, but thanks in large part to the Mary Queen of Vietnam Church, is able to organize and actually protest against a toxic landfill that was going to be built near their community. So that type of activism work, helps to restore this sense of place, restore this sense of community. But we can also talk about gardening, foodways. Another thing that, especially in Versailles and elsewhere, again, our informant's house in Plaquemines Parish, one of the ways that people helped to dwell and build a sense of place was through traditional foodways, through gardening. And this is a connection to tradition, but traditional food, traditional medicines, but it also becomes a meeting place. The garden is a social space where older generations can meet with younger generations. So people who maybe themselves didn't go through the refugee experience can hear about it from older generations who did. They can have this kind of longer generational connection. And they're actually building their connection to specific places through these types of embodied activities. And maybe we can say even shrimping, fishing would be maybe another example of this type of embodied practice. And so it's through these types of practices that ultimately people are shaping their both religious and conceptions or place attachment. And ultimately that's what's helping to shape these narratives of resilience and also facilitate this connection to place. So just to kind of summarize really quickly, the idea that the narratives of progress and survival that Van Lammingham pointed out in this project, we agree that, yeah, that was certainly a key dimension of how this community, experienced these issues of Katrina and the oil spill, but then also looking specifically at religion as a set of institutions, in this case, the Catholic Church and Buddhist associations, but also how religion is a meaning-making activity that builds out of these embodied place-based experiences. So where did the narratives happen? Well, they were shaped in among other places, these gardens, these traditional foodways, shaped after things like Katrina, to help people understand their experience and motivate them to return. So the theme of just kind of wrapping up here, how ultimately does this work speak to this One Health perspective? Well, I think it's valuable to look at theologies, perspectives from within religious traditions, look at religious institutions and see what they're saying about health, what they're saying about ecology, the natural world, these types of questions, because they are saying quite a lot. And that's not something that should just be ignored in our broader considerations of policy and technical issues. But then also religious studies, as I hope I've indicated a little bit, can help us to see some of these deeper ethical, moral dynamics that shape people's responses beyond just Christian or Buddhist views of nature. It's also the practice of how we make meaning, how we shape our identities out of these types of events. And so ultimately seeing how religious studies is part of a kind of interdisciplinary approach to see how health is integrated within broader social and ecological connections. So finally, just to conclude, my own work is perhaps a little bit unique within religion and nature. It's not necessarily representative of what everybody does. So just to leave you all with a couple of resources, if you want to learn more about this or integrate this own type of work into your own work, obviously the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology, they maintain a website that has dozens and dozens of different faith statements about religions and the environment, has all sorts of primary resources to find. International Society for the Study of Religion, Nature, and Culture is another resource. They're actually having a conference next week in Phoenix, but it'll be online, or parts of it will be online. So if you're interested in that, you can tune in to some of the meetings online there. Obviously, UNEP's Faith for Earth Initiative, another international NGO or another international organization dealing with specifically outreach to faith communities. Some volumes, Encyclopedia of Religion and Nature, the library here on campus has it. The library also has some of the Religions of the World and Ecology series they have there in their possession. And then also me, if you're interested in incorporating these types of religious questions, religious communities into your own work, if you're not already doing it, then I'm happy to help however I can. And if it's not something that I do myself, I can hopefully connect you to somebody out there in the world who does. And so I'm happy to serve as a resource in that way for folks. So that's it. That's kind of a brief introduction to some of the work I've been up to. Hopefully that's interesting to you all. And I guess now we've got some time for questions or comments. So I guess we can hand it over to that. So thank you.
Thank you, Joe. That was great. I'm gonna have to go back and rewatch that actually, because there were some quotes in the beginning that were like really impactful. Sorry, my audio is doing something strange. Thank you. So if anyone has any questions, you should be able to unmute yourself now and ask yourself, or you can put things in the chat if you would prefer.
Hi, Joe. Thanks a lot for the information. My name is Nolan. Joe, I was curious from your perspective, how do religious folks justify the degradation of the environment? Is it from a perspective of, is it through ignorance? Is it through faith? Is it through misinformation? Yeah, just kind of curious about your perspective on that.
Yeah, well, that's, I mean, my own work, I guess, focuses specifically on the US South and Southern Appalachia. So I've predominantly worked with, majority Christian communities, but obviously lots more other, religious responses to a question like that. I guess to one degree, a lot of people don't like it. I think of Alan Johnson, who is with Christians for the Mountains, and he specifically said that environmental destruction is a sin. And so specifically he sees religion as motivating his work against it. However, for those people who do offer religious arguments for, the world has fallen apart, glory, hallelujah, that perspective certainly does exist. Again, speaking from, say, Christian perspectives, sometimes we associate this with certain end times views, that actually the decline of nature is actually a sign of, the coming end times, which is a good thing for the saved. The idea that, as Paul says, that their problem was that they confused the creation for the creator. The idea that the problem between the early Christian and the pagan communities was this, the idea that it's the supernatural that is worthy of our concern, not the natural. So that kind of historical antipathy toward venerating the natural world is certainly present within some theological communities. A lot of work, if we think about the climate change issue in particular, a lot of what I think is compelling research argues that it's really not necessarily that people are saying, well, the Bible says we shouldn't care about nature, the end, therefore I don't care about climate change. It has a lot more to do with, say, political issues, skepticism about scientific authority, and skepticism about, political issues, than it does specifically with theological issues. And maybe the theology comes in as a justification, but it's not the motivating factor for why, say, certain religious groups deny things like climate change. Instead, it's more kind of a political identification that, it's a broad conspiracy that's out to get us, with this climate change stuff. So we need to oppose it, is the view there. So there's a lot, right, that you can say about that type of question. I hope that gives you a little bit more of a sense. But thank you. That's a great question.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah.
Vitaly?
Okay, if I ask? Yeah, okay, thank you. I wonder, I don't know if religion is the only thing that unites people, right? People get united by many different things, and inside in some ways you can actually start calling them religion. I don't know, anti-vaxxers, for example, people who deny vaccination and, you know, have protests. Having unions, you could argue in some cases it's to a degree religion, right? There's some people get very crazy about that. Some people are not, and there's positive things in it. So I'm curious, are you, and I think in many cases when there is even that part of your Vietnamese communities recovering quicker, I always wonder if there's alternative explanations for whether it was driven by religion or just, you know, origin from which they came, and there were just more connection there versus some communities were not as connected, and whether that's religion or not doesn't matter. I mean, as long as people are connected because they watch the same movies, I don't know, from Vietnam or listen to the same music. So my question is, how much do you think what you study that relates to truly religion, it's really not about religion, but it's more about what connects people. People connect, and then they start associating themselves with a particular group that they will sacrifice some of the personal things for the group. They'll go and protest or something. They'll say, because I think that's what it is. Religion is just one of the oldest way of organizing people. That's, you know, it's been for 2,000 years. Church has been organizing people for crusades and other things, etc., or just keeping them in order so they don't overthrow the kings and stuff. So how is that you think it's spilling over what you're doing to really understanding just groups, human groups, and how they kind of become organized, etc.? Because I think that's what the core of it is, actually. Religion is just one pathway to organize.
Actually, entirely agree. I think of religion, I don't see religion as being the solution to the problem here. And in religious studies, again, we have this, you know, I'll call it old-fashioned. I'm sorry, that's kind of a judgment. You know, I don't want to disparage people who do this type of work, but this idea that religion is something unique in the human experience, that religion is sui generis, that religion refers to something that's out there in the universe that's not other stuff. But critical religious studies, again, maybe it's just kind of my own disciplinary proclivities. I think a lot of the stuff that I was talking about, geographers would say, oh, we do that too. Sociologists, anthropologists, you know, historians would say, oh, we are, or philosophers would already say, yeah, we say that same thing. We just don't use the word religion. And yeah, I think that's true. I think that religion for me is an entryway into the human experience. It's not necessarily studying something that is religion that exists out there in the universe somewhere beyond people, but instead it's a way of looking into the human experience. And as you pointed out, yeah, relationships, interaction. In fact, Emil Durkheim, his whole definition of religion is that, you know, religion is, you know, that which unites into a single moral community, basically the beliefs and practices that unite into a single moral community, all who adhere to them. So religion for him is just the name that we give to the symbols and practices that unite a community. And that's Durkheim's work. Others, you know, have similar theories. And I think critical religious studies would agree that in 21st century United States, we have this word that we use, religion, that we apply to a lot of specific stuff, but it doesn't have to be that way. And even if we go back 2,000 years, people didn't necessarily call themselves religious, right? It's actually historically relatively new that people even use that word. And it's something of a, you know, even more Western phenomena. Even a lot of the Vietnamese refugees, right, who were adamant about being religious, well, it was oftentimes the Catholic refugees. The Buddhist people would oftentimes like, you know, religion isn't really. I mean, I go to the temple. You know, we invite a priest over to, you know, do some ceremonies at the beginning of fishing season, but not really religious, right? They were less, you know, overt about, you know, being religious as part of their identities. So I guess kind of a long-winded answer here, but I'm basically, I think I agree in a lot of ways that there's something fundamental about the human experience that has to do with connections, that has to do with meaning making and identities, that we can use religion theory to help theorize and understand, but religion theory isn't necessarily the only thing going on, and religion itself isn't necessarily the only thing that's going to help us solve these problems.
Can I ask a question? You know me, I always ask questions, and other people, please turn on your cameras and feel free to jump in and ask questions. But Joe, I was wanted to ask you about indigenous religions. You clearly are centered in Christian traditions. And matter of fact, it just speaks to that previous question in some ways, because indigenous people do not necessarily see themselves as practicing religion, right? But I wonder if you just want to comment on your selection here and what drew you to this particular research base in environmental contexts.
Yeah, so with indigenous issues, obviously with the mountaintop removal, it was certainly present, but it's also, me as a non-indigenous person, kind of dealing with indigenous communities was also a bit of a challenge. There are a lot of deeper complexities, ethical issues with doing research within indigenous communities. One of the ways that it actually manifested in the mountaintop removal stuff was people like Judy Bonds or people like Maria Gano saying that, we Appalachians inherited this from our, Cherokee heritage and stuff like that. And in a lot of ways, that's part of the narrative of identity, but it's also problematic in a number of ways. And so it just kind of raises a lot of issues. In my own contemporary work, as I'm actually, what I didn't really talk about was what I'm doing now, which is actually having to do with this kind of productive view of place. If anybody's read Emily Hilliard's recent book, and she just gave a talk at Union Avenue Books, but she's a folklorist she works in West Virginia, and folklore is oftentimes seen as this thing that's all about the past. It's all preserving this backward looking, tradition that needs to be preserved. But for her, she's kind of like what I'm looking at religion. She says folklore is the stories that we tell about ourselves, the present and the future. Right? So folklore is forward looking. So I'm interested in seeing how people are shaping visions of place in Appalachia that aren't about preserving that which is going to be destroyed, but how about forming visions of place that actually shape more just futures. And Robin Wall Kimmerer's work, of course, for me is very influential. She talks about there's obviously this challenge of non-Indigenous people trying to appropriate Indigenous practices, but she argues that you don't have to pretend that you're an Indigenous person to nonetheless develop a sense of care for the natural world. She calls it becoming nativized to place. So that's the way that I'm seeing kind of Indigenous perspectives working into the future of my work, not in, trying to say understand the complexities of Indigenous cultures themselves, but how, what are the insights that these particular cultures can share to people like me, non-Indigenous people, for affecting more kind of positive futures for everybody. The other part of the question was, how did I get into this work?
Your selection I think you've actually addressed it, but just what led you to these particular religious traditions?
Yeah, I guess I had a teacher in graduate school who said, one thing that you'll discover as you keep doing your research is that what you're really studying is yourself. And so I think as a person, from the South with a lot of interest in Appalachia, from perhaps some of these communities I'm describing with my own experiences in the natural world, I'd say that, yeah, there's something very autobiographical in my own work, which obviously limits it in a lot of ways, but I try to be upfront and acknowledge that I'm not representing all possible, for example, with mountaintop removal, not all possible views on the subject, but a specific subset. With the Vietnamese American, that was actually a specific project from NOAA. So we were kind of commissioned in that case. For example, there are also Laotian and Cambodian refugees. We were kind of limited on the specific groups of people based on that particular project. Also, obviously, the Homa group of indigenous group on Ile de Jean Charles, some of the first kind of one of the first places to be inundated by climate change here in the continental United States. So obviously another big indigenous community facing issues there that we didn't really get into in that work. But yeah, that's just a little bit about that.
We may have time for one more question if anyone has one or comment.
I have a question, or actually, I guess it's more of a comment. Very interesting. Thank you so much. As I was listening to the beginning, when you were talking about the people of Appalachia, the woman who was a root gatherer, I think the thing that maybe makes a difference for if you're looking at the climate change and what is happening is if you can see what's happening to you directly, makes you more involved, makes you more want to stand up. If you don't really see it and you're hearing, oh, this is a big hoax or whatever, then maybe you're going to fall in that camp. But if you are, digging roots and you're seeing, things are thawing a month earlier than they did, and I can plant later than if you see it in your daily life, you're going to take maybe the religion that you already have and use that to go down that path. So it's almost, and also the people who, the miners who were like, please go home, tree huggers. Well, it's affecting them, not maybe emotionally, but pocketbook wise. So they have a different sort of path to take. So I don't know that that's a question, but I just thought it was interesting.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of the, on climate change views in particular, Americans are increasingly concerned about climate change, but do you think it'll impact you? Well, Americans are less concerned about that. So they think it's something that's happening, but it's over there somewhere. It's not something that impacts me. And so that's perhaps, people just don't have the immediate impacts. Although I have friends who live in Miami, for example, where, the sunny day flooding, this is true on the coast as well. There's a Highway 1 that runs right by the ocean there, floods regularly now. So increasingly it's becoming harder and harder to ignore, but people are trying. But yeah, I think surveys kind of, play that out, what you're saying, that if people can have their own specific experiences, it becomes real, and they tend to have a little bit more concern about it. So.
Well, let's all let you close us out. I'm putting a link to the UT Humanities Center in the chat as well. And if you're interested in our programming, I hope you give us a look. And thank you, Joe, so much for that fabulous presentation. Thank you.
Cool.
Yes, thank you so much. That was wonderful. Like I said, if anyone wants to watch this again, it'll be on our website, probably by tomorrow afternoon. And please join us for our next seminar. It's on Thursday, February 23rd, and we'll be joined by Dr. Fortunate Faka. He is a postdoc at Northwest University in South Africa, and he's going to be talking about South Africa's frog and reptile biodiversity and how it interacts with the country's diversity and indigenous populations. And thank you so much. We appreciate you coming here today. Everyone have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.